Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Captain's Table. I am your guest host, Mike Gatto, and I served 4 terms in the California State Legislature. And the founders of this podcast think that it is interesting and engaging to have someone who is used to being interviewed himself to do the interviewing of fantastic and interesting guests. And today we are blessed to have a fantastic and interesting guest by the name of Henry Ramos. Henry is a senior fellow at the New School Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, and he's a former member of the California Community College Board of Governors, along with so much other things. And we're going to talk with him about a bunch of fantastic topics. Henry, welcome.
Hey, Mike, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm excited to exchange with you.
Fantastic. So, Henry, I've got a lot of fascinating questions for you today. The first one that I'd like to start with is one that I've heard from other people, and I've certainly read in your writings. And you've written before, essentially, and I want to, sort of paraphrase this, but California has a reputation for being a very progressive state. We have a reputation for being a very democratic state, and we have a reality where, Democrats control supermajorities in both houses of the legislature. We've had the governor's mansion now for, a generation. But you've written that California hasn't lived up to its reputation as a progressive bastion, and that there hasn't been meaningful movement on certain things. Why don't you tell our listeners what you mean, and then tell us why you think this status quo is what it is?
Great way to start. I do want to give California great credit. I'm a proud, citizen of the Golden State, born and raised, and I think California does have great claims to remarkable leadership in the political economy and governance, going back to the progressive era when we went to direct democracy with our referendum system. And we've done some great things over the years. And, I think that, the Brown legacy has some markers that I think will stand the test of time. I think his work around high-speed rail, the rainy day fund, those are all good things. But I think fundamentally what California lacks, especially currently, is a working state industrial policy that can really lift all boats. For the reasons that you mentioned, it's kind of odd and strange, Mike, that California, this progressive bastion here in the West, has not been able to get single-payer health care, although a strong majority of our citizens want to see that. We have difficulty getting basic increases in revenues because we have a supermajority requirement at the state and local levels that, because you're a former state official and local official, really makes it very difficult to generate new revenues. And, we just have a number of other structural considerations that I think make it difficult for us to govern a state that is increasingly difficult to manage. And I think in particular, without a more intentional strategy, without a more significant, even constitutional commitment to elevating certain rights that people are really struggling to make meet in areas like education and employment, health and housing, transportation, without some significant next generation strategy and investment. My fear is that California will continue to lead in many respects, but will essentially continue to lose its comparative advantage to states like Texas, Florida, and other states around the country, and other entities around the world that are competing with us.
So tell me, and we'll come back to several of the things you mentioned in your reply there, but tell me what you think California should specifically do. So, this podcast has a lot of listeners who are high-placed political staffers in Sacramento. Certain members of the legislature listen to this podcast. If you could wave a magic wand and you could, have the ear of some key lawmakers, or for that matter, if you could wave a magic wand and do this yourself, tell us specifically what you think California should do. What policies would you like to see?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to pretend that I have the magic wand or that I have all the answers. In fact, right now I'm working with a very informed activated group of California leaders in various spaces in women's rights and homelessness and housing policy and education, racial and other equity concerns. And I think what we're all acknowledging is that we have seen that because of the things I mentioned at the outset of the conversation, Mike, we are facing significant challenges moving forward. No one is pretending in our conversation or in others that I think are happening around the state that it's as easy as just waving a magic wand or just doing this, that, or the other thing. But I do think that there are some fundamental, directions that I think we can begin to move in. One is, and I think that we're getting probably to this point where there will be support for this in the population at large, we need to rethink our referendum system because, as we've seen, although there is really, really strong merits to a direct democracy system, and it's benefited us in so many ways over the decades, there is room for machination. A lot of the corporate interests, the moneyed interests, because of the nature of our campaign finance laws, have infiltrated on a number of occasions to either mitigate or reverse the will of the people after we voted for significant changes in a given direction. We need to look at that and revisit whether there's ways that we can prevent that from happening so that the will of the voters is really the principal policy directive that we take to heart. I think that we do need to look at issues around our zoning laws and around local control, particularly given these supermajority requirements around revenue generation. We have a significant homelessness problem and a housing problem, as you know, in terms of affordability and access. And a lot of what we see is basically not in my backyard. And I understand, and we all are sensitive to the realities that people want quality of life, and they're concerned about what may happen if we overdevelop in their neighborhoods. But on the other hand, we have huge social problems and massive crime and public outlays happening because we're not attending to this problem. So structurally and fundamentally, we need to look at that. We also know that we have a very significantly sweeping change upon us in our demographics. This has already begun to take shape in our political economy, but Black and brown young people, Asian young people are making up a growing preponderance of our population and our future workforce and our future leadership. And in so many ways, I think that we have failed to invest in that part of our population in a way that would really be commensurate with the kinds of responsibilities that we're going to be needing to take on as a state. So all of those are things that we need to look at. And I think that deliberative processes that involve political leaders with community leaders, media leaders, action researchers, people that do the kind of work that I do, and other stakeholders is essential to rethink the California of the 21st century. It may require 2 or 3 years for us to get to a point where we can reach a consensus like that. But I think through a common narrative, I think through common dialogue, and I think through reason and logic, I think we are getting to a point now where we're ready not only to have this conversation, but to answer the questions that you have raised, which, I think would probably lead us to potentially some constitutional revisions, potentially the idea of embedding as fundamental rights, free K through 14 education, single-payer health care for all residents and citizens of the state, affordable, safe, and guaranteed housing, guaranteed employment for people who can't find appropriate living wage work in the private economy provided by the state to enable them to contribute their skills or talents or vision to the solutions that we so badly need as a state. So I think it's a bundle of all of these sort of new possibilities in thinking and in action that we need to organize in a more ordered way. And we need to think again, I think the basic call to action, Mike, is not so much to do this within the context of our normal cycles of budgeting. We might even need to think about multi-year budgeting cycles, and we certainly would need to think about common commitments or goals that our elected leaders make and lay down that endure each and every change in administration that we see so that, we can actually have a through line. I know that high-speed rail has been lamented in so many ways, but it is a big idea, and it's one that, for better or for worse, we have found a way to stay with. And I think at some point in the future, the benefits of those investments will be felt, although it's been clumsy getting out of the box on that. But we need big ideas like that. We need, revenue and job-generating ideas that are going to kind of help our workforce, help our populace and our people, be more productive, be more coherent, and, find a higher quality of life.
So you mentioned many issues that I think our listeners have a keen interest in, and I'm just going to go through a few really quickly and get your takes on them. So you mentioned zoning changes. I've sometimes wondered why we have such a battle for zoning right now in the state. And what I mean by that is, a few years ago, there were so many bills that were so controversial. Many of them were authored by State Senator Wiener in San Francisco, and were so controversial, and there's so much heartache and so much divisiveness, and you had people just going crazy on both sides. And when all was said and done, I think the goal of these bills really was to, essentially develop the corridors in major cities. For example, one of his most controversial bills was that bill, of course, that would have essentially given, or greatly reduced the height restrictions along major transit corridors. And down to it, it basically applied to, 7 or 8 major cities in the state. And, the thought occurred to me as the mayors of some of these cities were lobbying for these changes, why didn't they just implement those changes themselves? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, because I think there's, a lot of local constraints and, frankly, the voters are concerned about their economic insecurity and no one wants to pay more taxes, so that's an understandable, resistance factor. But, at the same time, I think one of the reasons that I'm calling for a shift in narrative or a shift in perspective is because we think we're saving, we think we're doing better in the long run by kind of minimizing our tax rates. And, it's only natural to want to do that. But when you look at the California of today and the costs associated with so many of the pathologies that we're talking about, Mike, that never existed way back when, before we had supply-side economics. California had its problems in the 60s and 70s. I was there, trust me. But 175,000 people at night that were homeless, that was not a problem.
Schools that were... We'll come back to taxes, but I just want to stick to zoning for 1 minute. And trust me, there's a lot to talk about on taxes as well.
Sure.
But with the zoning issue, I just thought it was kind of curious. I mean, you had the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, friend of mine. I've known him for years. He had just gotten reelected with something like 76 or 80% of the vote. He was at the peak of his popularity, and he was lobbying the state legislature to change zoning laws statewide in a very controversial bill. And I mean, the question does remain, like, why do the mayors or the council in San Jose and Oakland and Los Angeles, where, I mean, to pick on Los Angeles, right? If Los Angeles wanted to say that along the Wilshire corridor or along the Figueroa corridor or any of these giant boulevards we have with ample transit and there aren't single family homes that close to most of these places, why would they not just say along these corridors, the sky's the limit, build whatever you want, versus going to the state house and saying, we're going to impose these rules on Malibu and on Atherton and on Bakersfield? I mean, why? It just seems kind of like an unnecessary fight.
Yeah, I can see your point. And, I think that there's something to be said about, different regional and local, realities bearing the need for different policy approaches, perhaps. But I do think that we need to find a way to get to some common standards and agreements. And that's the nature of, the challenge of political leadership. That's the burden of our elected officials, to find consensus and to educate, inform, and bring along the populace with them. I mean, one of the, things that happens in a democracy, obviously, is that, people, I think, do their best to stay informed and do their best to stay active. But we live in really complex times. People are very busy. It's hard for them to stay kind of eye on the prize. And oftentimes, the things that political leaders come up with, particularly things that cost money or that could cost money, are immediately like thumbs down. And I understand, because of the nature of the times we live in, people are really stressed. They're not economically secure and they don't want to pay more than they have to. But I do think that a large part of it comes with educating and informing the populace about the essential trade-offs that come with, pay now or pay later. And I also think that, the frank reality is that even though we've had large debates around what is the responsibility of the super wealthy and the wealthy to pay their fair share, I think we still have some ways to go in California where we can capture more of those dollars at the top. And frankly, use that as a way to mitigate the impact on the middle class or on working class Californians to have to pay for so much of the kind of investment that we're actually going to need. There's no simple solution to this, Mike, or obviously it would have been attended. We would have solved this problem or set of problems a long time ago if it were easy. What I'm suggesting is that we need to change the conversation, and we need to think about the conversation in different time contexts. We need a longer runway. We need a larger strategy. We need public engagement and consensus so people can feel a part of this and understand the net benefits to our state. And a lot of it's not just sort of making it up. I mean, when you look at the times that I referred to earlier in the 50s and the 60s, when California was really robust with investments in our master plan for education, massive public investment in our roads, our bridges, our highways, our waterways. These are things that really lifted up our agricultural sector, our aerospace industry, blew up our tourism and our entertainment, and we're the precursors to our tech industry. It took public investment to make that happen. It didn't happen just because, and it didn't happen just because private investors drove that. We need to reinvent that kind of thinking and action in the early 21st century, so that for the balance of the century, but we have those wings to ride.
Great. So, I know you have a lot of expertise in the issue of finance and taxes, and the conversation has certainly gone in that direction. So let's talk taxes for a little bit. And then I think we'll get to some other fascinating discussions about direct democracy and homelessness and some other things.
Sure.
So with respect to taxes, I had the most fascinating conversation fairly recently, and I tweeted about it, and I talked about it, and with a whole bunch of people in my life, and that is, it seems to me that I learned rather that the very wealthy, often don't pay taxes. It's more of the middle class and the upper middle class that pay taxes that that everybody out there thinks of as conventional taxes. For example, if somebody has a high net worth that's tied with, founding a company, these are the Elon Musks of the world, the Mark Zuckerbergs, and they have so much net worth that's tied up in the stock. They never really sell that stock. They never realize a capital gain and then are forced to pay the capital gains taxes. What they do is they just borrow against it for the rest of their life. And because borrowing is not income, you're actually going into debt in theory. These folks, and by the way, that's just one of 20 or 30 very esoteric tax avoidance techniques that we don't have time to go into. What do you say about? There are those who say that every time California changes our tax policies, we drive out the guy who owns an insurance agency and, the doctor who is a very high paid doctor, but he's a doctor nonetheless. And we drive out the middle executives, the brain power behind the programming at Facebook. Mm-hmm. But we're left with the state where you've got the super, super, super wealthy and then the very, 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 very poor and nothing in between.
Yeah. I think, your points at the top are well taken. There are loopholes and there are still margins that I think we can glean to get more revenue and capital out of that super wealthy crowd. I think that the fear of flight is, obviously something that has to be factored in. On the other hand, I think it's overstated. I don't want to seem overconfident, but California is a very unique place to do business. It's not just your average bare state. It's it's the fifth largest economy in the world. And I just feel like, for companies to actually leave the state is something that has its own costs attached to it. No guarantees of real long-term success, a lot of disruption for their workforces. You look at what Elon Musk just did, yanking our chain and taking his act down to Texas. It all sounds good on paper, but that's very disruptive for the people that are part of that business and for the business itself. And ultimately, California remains a place where, frankly, you can't be profitable in this country or in the world if you're not in California doing work here. So I think we're a little bit more fearful of our business class than we need to be. But also, I think that it's possible with the kind of approaches that I'm speaking to actually get business leaders to endorse some of these ideas that may seem in some measure like what the right likes to call socialism, but that, frankly, ultimately, in the scheme of things, are better for business. By investing in the ways that we've talked about, we're thinking about, the idea of building a new middle class, creating the prospects for a new generation of people who can earn living wages or upwardly mobile salaries, who can, do jobs, hopefully, that can be jobs that stay in the state in areas like renewables and recycling and other sectors that, are homegrown and home-rooted. And, at the federal level, one of the reasons that the president decided to go after a minimum individual and corporate tax is because he was seeing a lot of bleeding as well on the part of wealthy businesses and their owners kind of skipping out on their fair share. And I think that maybe California can think of a comparable approach. I don't see people like racing to get out of our market or out of the United States on a simple policy matter like that, however much they may feel strong feelings about it. And I think that we need to explore through study and through experimentation where there might be opportunities to calibrate the tax revenues so that we are principally taking it from the people at the top that are not paying their fair share And we're investing in people in the middle and at the bottom that really, through those investments, can do much more over time to produce additional revenue for our state to mitigate the hit that comes with them perhaps paying lower or no taxes.
Now, you mentioned in your introductory comments about when we talked about California's policies perhaps not mating up with the promise that a lot of us believe California has. You mentioned that we would not be competitive. I don't have your exact words, but you said something about, California will not be competitive with places like Texas and Florida. And now, what do you say to people who say that, Texas and Florida, I mean, you pick two places that, don't have an income tax, anything approaching like what we do. I can't quote off the top of my head, but I believe both those states don't have income taxes at all, or they certainly don't have them as high as California. California, for listeners who are not familiar, California has the most progressive income tax in the United States, and what that means is frankly, we tax the most. We're heavily dependent on income tax. What do you say to people who say, well, Texas and Florida are growing, California is shrinking, and the reason why they're competitive is because people view those states still as lands of promise and opportunity?
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about that in the short term, but I think in the longer term, I don't see Texas and Florida as being, that significant a threat to California if we make the right decisions here in California to maintain our singularity and leadership. Florida and Texas together really have collective GDPs that are only about as large as California's by itself. Just to put that in perspective, these states are not even close to California when it comes to GDP or when it comes to their weight in either the domestic or the international economy. It's not to say that they aren't important, but it's just to say that they're not even close to where California is. So when we talk about losing, it's a relative statement. We have a lot of room to go before we're at a level where we're talking about being like Texas or being like Florida. And I'm confident in the state's ability to regenerate new innovative ways at the top. I think that that's in the nature of our spirit and our culture as a state. But I do think that by virtue of not having those state taxes, it's just a matter of time before Texas and Florida, as they grow, become fraught with many of the same kinds of dilemmas that we see in California and New York and other states. There's a lot of people flowing into those states for sure, but very, very little infrastructure to support their social needs, particularly in downtimes economically or when they have a major, catastrophic event, like with their electrical grid as they had in Texas recently. And crime rates are growing in those states. So they talk about California, having a high crime rate. Florida actually has per capita the highest crime rate in the country right now. So they're beginning to see, I think, some of the limits of having kind of a very limited state taxation system to support the kinds of services and interventions that you would want to have, particularly as a state that's in the throes of a significant growth in its population and demographics, right? I think that California can stand on its own. I do think that it can't stand on its own just being still. And so my argument is not that California is like really wrong-headed or California is really failing. The argument is that we can do so much better, and particularly with Democratic leadership all across the board, it's curious that we're not doing more than we're doing now.
Yeah, and that is something that I've talked about with so many people who have been involved in California government, most of them on the Democratic side, and some folks question: is there just a general fatigue, or is it possible that the opposite is true? That we've come so far so fast that there's really not that much more to do. I'm always, I for one am always amused when I get asked for that meeting from the young and upcoming candidate who wants to go to the state legislature, and he says, California, I'm running as a progressive, and California's problems are that we don't have any progressive. And I mean,
right.
Because I just question that just from a logical standpoint, which is, we have plenty of people in California who are both self-defined progressives as well as, I think by any other metric, they're progressive. Is it possible that the systemic and structural issues are either very complicated or that they're not as simple as people think, right? And that's something which I think you've said. That's a point that you said, which is, a lot of these issues are not very easily digestible, and some of them are very, very in-depth. And I think that's something that, you have studied quite a bit at the Institute, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's always fascinating to
Mm-hmm.
hear your stuff. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about direct democracy. In my first years in the legislature, I focused on direct democracy reforms because I thought that there were some very frustrating aspects of direct democracy. The first ones that I identified, and maybe you think these make sense, maybe you hate them, but I was tired of, going out on the campaign trail and people would talk about a problem that was very much on their minds, and they would say, well, why can't the legislature just, and I started to call these conversations, why can't you just conversations? Because I would be at town hall after town hall, and people would come up to me, with a wounded look in their eye. We'd talk about a problem. We'd all acknowledge there's a problem. And they'd say, well, why can't you just, and I would say, well, prop this or prop that or prop this or prop that.
Yeah.
And the reality is that it ties the hands of the legislature. And I think at some point it provides an excuse, frankly, for the legislature. There's less
Mm-hmm.
budget authority. There's less real authority. And, it's something that Lord knows has been abused by special interests. For our listeners, most of our listeners are pretty familiar with the fact that the federal Constitution has been amended a very small number of times in our history. You put aside the Bill of Rights in the 1790s, and there's only been a constitutional amendment. I forget however many years, but it's
Less than 30 times. Yeah.
And we enshrine things in the federal Constitution like free speech and voting rights and things like that. But the California Constitution has been amended 400 and something times in our short existence. Yeah. And there are things in the California Constitution like what type of net you have to use when rock fishing off the coast of Santa Barbara. That's specific, right, in the Constitution. And so tell us what reforms to direct democracy you would like to see.
Well, I think that, you've stated the case really well, that, there is cost to everything. And I think in its purest form, the idea of direct democracy is quite elegant and really desirable. The idea of having the people, every so often be able to kind of directly state their point of view on a given topic. It's a nice impulse to democracy. On the other hand, as we've seen and alluded, it's very easy for this to become kind of a cumbersome conflict with respect to the role of the legislature in, taking the will of the people as they are elected and passing legislation that, goes through our normal process. And that can become problematic. We also know that we have seen a certain capture take hold of our referendum process by very moneyed interests, many times, as we've seen in recent cycles, outside of our state, that are driving huge sums of investment in our campaigns for things that just have to do with private or corporate interests, not really with the public interest at all. And I think the referendum system was designed, at least in its intentionality back in the day, as a way for common people, not privileged people or corporations, to kind of have their voice heard.
But how do you affect that? That is one of the challenges that I came headfirst with, right? And I've tried very hard to see both sides, right? I understand that if you are an interest group on the left, the right, the middle, wherever, business, labor, whoever, if you're an interest group and you feel like the legislature is not giving you justice and they're not doing what they need, you want to go to the public. But let's drill down to it. When Governor Hiram Johnson put forth these reforms in the 19-teens, California was, I forget the population, but it was like 1/40th of what it is now, possibly even 1/50th. And if you wanted to get something put on the ballot and let your fellow citizens vote for it, you could conceivably walk around with a petition and get the signatures, right? I mean, of course, it would take a little more than that. It might take 10 people doing it. But now, the numbers are so vast and they're only getting bigger. Again, for our listeners who don't know, to put something on the ballot, whether it's an initiative or a constitutional amendment or a referendum, you need a certain percentage of signatures of the people who voted in the last gubernatorial election. So, these are millions and millions of people, and obviously it's not something where, mom and pop can walk door to door with their petition anymore. It's something that takes millions of dollars. It takes an organized campaign of walk. I mean, is there any way to return this to the people?
Well, that is really the $64 million question, but you've identified the problem really eloquently. And I think that's something that requires us to deal with in a formalized, structured, smart way. Some time ago, you'll remember, since you were probably in the legislature at the time, Mike, when this happened, but California decided, and going in the other direction, to take the decision-making about redistricting out of the hands of the legislators and to put it in an independent redistricting commission. And, that move has suffered some criticism here, there, and in between. But I think overall, it's kind of stood the test of time, and it's proven to be a kind of a good way to have a little bit more objectivity and a little bit less politicization in the way that we draw those lines. It may be that not as a permanent structure, but that as a next stage, we need to have some kind of a special commission that is, appointed by the governor with the involvement of the legislature to take a look at these significant governance questions, looking at our Constitution, looking at the referendum system, looking at some of the embedded constraints that we have relative to the revenue generation issues that we covered at the top, and also looking at just the substantive impact of the way that we do our business, Mike, on some of the core concerns that we've raised in this conversation that are just foundational in terms of the kinds of policy priorities and investments we need to make if we are to retain our global status as a leader in the political economy of this nation and the world. So, when it comes to education, when it comes to employment, when it comes to housing and health and transportation, these are foundational, I would call them human rights. I think we need to think about kind of a human rights economy framework that ultimately is really rooted in serving the people and the planet and not so much in serving profit and privilege and power. And we've got it upside down right now. I think our whole system is rooted in a kind of a delivery system for the privileged and the wealthy, and we're not getting the love that we need in the middle and at the bottom, and that's really what we need to reverse. However we do it, I don't have an elegant response to your question about the specifics, but we need some kind of an orderly process that is inclusive and that is cross-sectoral in terms of how we go about reaching a new consensus on how to govern a state as large, as complex, and as consequential as California is.
Now, has the Institute looked into the possibility of a constitutional convention? Years ago during the Great Recession, I mean, this is about 10 or 12 years ago now, with California facing so many challenges, particularly around the spending constraints. There was a lot of talk. Nick Bergruen, several others, California Forward. Yep. These groups are putting forth the idea of a constitutional convention because, of course, courts have ruled that there's only so much you can do at the ballot box. You can put forth a constitutional amendment by the ballot, but if it's a constitutional revision, the only path to do it is to go to a constitutional convention, and kind of hard to call that. But is that something that you guys have looked at specifically?
We are in a study group right now with some very significant California leaders who are, in various spaces. We have organizations at the table like the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles, the End Child Poverty movement in California. We have the leadership of the California Budget and Policy Center, the Women's Foundation of California, very broad, cross-cutting, multi-gender, multiracial leaders that are coming at the issues from very different perspectives. Often these leaders that have worked exclusively in silos on these issues and now, for the first time are coming together because they realize that we can't do it in silos. We can't do it as a piecemeal proposition. We have to do it in harmony. But I think that, I can't proclaim that the Institute is ready to declare that this is something that we're going to see through, but it is an idea that is very worthy of consideration. California Calls and other organizations that are concerned about these larger questions, I think, have also really put their finger on this conundrum that we've talked about here in this conversation. And we do need to do something active, quick, and thoughtful, because the one thing you don't want to do in the situation that we're in, Mike, is to wait until there is even a hairier crisis. The COVID, the racial reckoning, the economic uncertainties of the last years have been pretty unsettling. And miraculously, I'm not saying that we got through it as well as we would all like, but miraculously, California, for the most part, endured, although obviously we've come out of that with far less of a rosy outlook on our finances. We clearly have taken a deficit turn. But what you want to do in relationship to thinking out loud about what California can and should be decades forward You want to get ahead of this when you have an absence of crisis. You don't want to be moved to have to make these kinds of strategic decisions without deliberative process. And in an emergency, it's hard to do that. Yeah. So I would say it would behoove us to kind of take this on in a structured series of dialogues with some kind of a vehicle of the kind perhaps that you just mentioned being the principal goal, to at least get us in a place where we can really move towards a much more clear consensus that would involve our business and our labor communities, our social justice and gender and racial justice leaders, our political leaders, our stakeholders on the ground in neighborhoods and communities. This needs to be an all-hands-on-deck situation, because my fear is that with the recurrence of catastrophic events that we're seeing in our economy, in our environment, in our social relations, there's no margin for error. There's no room to spare in terms of waiting to get at this. California is a state that has always thought big and acted big. Some may say this is just too monstrous. This is just not worth the effort. But frankly, I kind of feel like if it doesn't happen here in California, I think our prospects as a state will diminish. And I think, frankly, if we don't lead on this, other states and regions around the country will suffer. California has always been a harbinger of change across the country. If we can get our arms around this, I think we can have a lot to say about a higher quality of life, a more robust and inclusive economy, and a better way of doing our public business going forward as a nation.
Yeah. Well, now let's shift gears a bit, and let's go into some other things that I think might be interesting for our listeners, and that is,
sure.
I'm told your father grew up with Tom Bradley, the sort of legendary mayor of Los Angeles, and
that is correct.
And maybe you could tell our listeners a few stories about what that was like to sort of be along for the ride as Tom Bradley rose to power in this city.
Oh, I'd be happy to. Well, my dad and Tom Bradley grew up together. I went to Rosemont Elementary School in Los Angeles, and later they went to the original Los Angeles Polytechnic High School, which was in the main part of the city. Now, of course, it's out in North Hollywood. You probably know some about that. That was probably in your district, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. But they grew up as young men, and Tom was a very gifted student and student leader. He was elected to the student government. Even back then, he was a star athlete. My father was on the football team with Tom. They were a couple of years apart, but they became friends. Interestingly, my dad went on in his pursuits and took on a much more conservative Reagan Republican sort of inclination. And Tom Bradley obviously went the way of Democratic Party politics, much closer to my own personal politics, actually, and revolutionized the city of Los Angeles, I think, turning it into, by all measures, a world-class city, not just an important national center. And despite their political differences, and they were often on the other side of one another in major city, politics and controversies that affected, the day, they remained close friends. And I remember vividly, at the end of their respective lives, I had an opportunity to take them to lunch together on Olvera Street in downtown LA. And they recounted in very fascinating ways, Mike, the movie that they had been watching, looking at Los Angeles from young boys in the 1920s to the city that it had become by that time in the mid-1990s. And it was quite impressive to hear two men in conversation who had been on that journey, seeing the radical changes that have taken shape in our state and our region, Tom being a central part of that. And to reflect back on, just the simple origins that they started with. Tom Bradley did confide in that conversation that the election that he ran, particularly the first time against then Mayor Yorty, which he lost in 1968, was an extremely belittling and unfortunate experience for him. There was a lot of racism thrown at him in that cycle. And interestingly enough, even 30 years after the fact, when the mayor spoke about it, he welled up with tears. I could see that the pain was still there, and he took that with him to his grave. Wow. But that notwithstanding, obviously Tom Bradley was a man of incredible consequence for our city, for our state, and our country. And I was privileged to know him in the way that my father and I did.
And you've been friends with another one of Los Angeles' mayors too, right? Which is, of course, Antonio Villaraigosa.
Well, friends, I wouldn't say. We certainly have bumped into each other a lot. And I have the highest regard for Antonio. And, certainly I think in his, leadership as a Speaker of the Assembly, he did some important lifting for our state. And I think that's something we owe him a great deal of debt for.
And then tell me a little bit about your relationship with Gil Cedillo. Obviously he recently left office in a very unfortunate circumstance. He was a participant in that difficult conversation that
Yeah.
Was widely excoriated for the racist underpinnings of it. Do you think that? Tell me what you think his legacy will end up being.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to take some prerogative and speak, about him, but also Kevin DeLeon, who is another person that was a champion of mine. It helped me get onto the board of governors for the community colleges when I was appointed to that position by Governor Brown. Both of these individuals are people that have made significant contributions to not just the Latino voice and presence in our state from a political standpoint, but for so many other groups, particularly struggling immigrant groups, working moms and families, people that have really, really been up against it for the reasons we've talked about in the other parts of this conversation. And I've had the highest regard for them over the years in terms of their willingness to really make major personal sacrifices to see through some of those important contributions and changes. That said, like so many other individuals, not just of Latino or minority backgrounds, I was very disturbed to hear the comments come to light that they shared ostensibly privately in a conversation that just spun out of control and really got away from what we should have our elected officials talking about. So it's a bittersweet thing. I really feel sad for both men because I think that, in effect, I think this has been deal-breaking for their political careers, and it's a sad way to end careers that otherwise have been so rich with contribution. But in the day and time in which we live, and it's probably always been this way, but now more than ever, there is no such thing as a private conversation when you're in elected office. There's just no such thing. And when it does come to light that you've been engaged in dialogue that is antithetical to the things that you say you stand for and that are antithetical to the values of most people in our body politic, there's a price to be paid. And I'm sad to say that both have had to pay a very high price. We'll see what happens with Kevin on his reelection coming up, in due course. But I'm not optimistic about Kevin's chances to retain that seat. And I think, I feel sad for my friend Gil, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Now let's talk about another person that who crossed your life and made a big impact, and that's Ken Burt. I know that you are the chair of the Memorial Scholarship for Ken Burt, and for people who are listening who have not heard of Ken Burt, of course, he was for many, many years, he was the head of CFT and a major force in California politics, somebody who cared very much about our education system. Tell us a little bit about this. Well, tell us about Ken. Tell us about the Memorial Scholarship. And if there are listeners who want to donate, let's tell them how.
Hey, Mike, I'm so grateful for that opportunity. Thank you. Well, Ken Burt sadly left us way too early. A couple of years ago, he died of a horrible combination of Lou Gehrig's disease and multiple sclerosis. And it caught up with him very quickly. He was, only 60 years old at the time of his passing. Ken and I went to UC Berkeley together as undergrads, and we met, I think, around the first days of our experience there. We were 17 years old. We were babies. And he, like myself, was very involved in student politics. He was an elected member of the Senate, and he was actively involved at that time. And really, very for his age, I think he was very advanced in terms of his engagements. He was involved with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, the United Farm Workers, as an advocate for their labor struggles. He was a Edward M. Kennedy presidential delegate when Ted Kennedy ran for the presidency in 1980 to challenge President Carter. And, he was a very young man when he was doing all this stuff. And we used to riff on that. We took common courses and we were involved in common political activities at UC Berkeley. And then, as fate would have it, a few years later, we both ended up simultaneously attending the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, where we both studied politics. And we had a chance to resume our ongoing dialogue and our troublemaking, if you will. And then Ken went on, as you suggested earlier, to be the main person at the California Federal. I suspect you, like so many others, were probably a beneficiary of that leadership at some point. But Ken's work, not only as a source of political, fundraising, but as an idea guy, as a connector, as just a really good person who was there to do the right thing. His legacy is unsurpassed that way, and really tough to kind of face each day without a guy like Ken Burt. He was, for decades, this guy that I could pick up the phone and and talk to, and he'd give me perspective and reassurance, and he'd have answers that I could only dream of formulating for myself. And he's surely missed, and the state of California is not quite the same state without him at the helm over there at the Teachers Federation.
And tell us about the scholarship. Who does it seek to benefit?
Thank you so much. Well, the scholarship is designed to support UC Berkeley undergraduate students who are participants in the summer internship program that they have called Cal in Sacramento. And they also have a democracy camp, which is a kind of a school-based extracurricular activity that helps young people get involved in, political discourse, community organizing, action research. So it is based at the Sacramento Area Region Foundation, which is the local community foundation in the city of Sacramento. You can go online and look for the Ken Burt Fund. And what we're doing, Mike, is every summer we're supporting one or two young people who are coming out of UC Berkeley with interest in education policy, labor policy, and civil rights and social justice policy, the issues that gave Ken most of his passion. And we are asking them to do internships in different legislative offices, in executive offices, and around the agencies and the nonprofits that have so much to do with policymaking in Sacramento. They learn about how policy is made, they network and gain relationships that are important for them to build on going forward, and they can concretize their ideas about where to take their own talents and their own passions. So it's a labor of love. We just had our first two interns complete their cycles this summer, just last week, and we're looking for more support. So if you just go to the Sacramento Area Region Foundation website, you should be able quickly to find that Ken Burt Fund, and any donation of any size would be most welcome.
That sounds like a fantastic program. I've always believed that, exposing young people who are going through the educational system to the government is one of the biggest services that we can do, because, let's face it, our state probably does not do as much as we could to teach civics, and and in many cases, students are, questioning, why are things the way they are? And the answer is, well, the government, right? And so it's fantastic to help them learn about it. And so bless you for doing that.
Thank you. Thanks for your endorsement.
Yeah. So I have, sort of one last question. I always ask this of, folks who come on the Captain's Table, and that is, tell us, you can phrase this negatively or phrase it positively, but tell us one policy that, you think you could say the state, the Democratic Party, whoever, that we're not doing well on, something that you think we're just totally missing the boat. Or, we could phrase this in a more positive sense, which is, what is one specific thing, and it doesn't have to be big, just tell us one specific thing that you think that policymakers could do better, that they should be focusing on right now. Obviously, we talked about a lot of these, tax policy. We talked about, enshrining certain rights in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. We talked about, direct democracy reform and things like that. But maybe is there one thing that you disagree with right now that you think is just a wrong-headed policy, or is there one thing that you'd like to see a focus on?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I'm going to go on the one thing that I might like to see happen more of. And that is, I think, our policies and our procedures around voting. I think that, there are some groups that are pretty significant in number across our state that are folks who have paid taxes, or folks that have lived in the state, who are residents and who still are not voting. Immigrants are one. I know it's an unpopular notion because a lot of people think, well, how dare we invite immigrants to, be involved in our local and state elections. But I think that when you consider the stake that population has in terms of the contributions that it's made to our economy, to our culture, paying taxes and not being represented is something antithetical to being American, and I think we should fix that. Consequently, and similarly, I would make the same argument for some of our offender population, folks who were involved in nonviolent crimes and who have had some difficulties, either procedurally or otherwise, to kind of reinstate themselves to vote. And I think above all, Mike, I think the main answer that I want to bring to the question is youth. I really feel that we are not doing a good job. You mentioned the lack of civics education in our schools, the lack of opportunities for young people to really get engaged in public and social problem solving. You've seen and I've seen over recent years that the appetite is large. Young people have a lot to contribute and they want to. They don't always show up to vote, and we can change that. We can make it easier for them. We can get into, experimentations in digital voting. We can get into experimentation in terms of registering young people in our schools as they're about to turn 18. We can do a lot more to engage them in terms of public promotion and encouragement. We're not doing enough of that, and I think that because that youth population has such a different orientation, one that's much closer to the kinds of ideas that I was touting at the outset of our call, I think we're missing a lot by not having those voices at the ballot box. I think it would do a lot to change the outcomes of our elections, even if we just raise the voter population by 10%. By having new and younger voters coming out, I think we would see much bigger margins and much clearer direction leading towards progressive sensibilities. And by not doing that, I think we're holding ourselves and our state back.
Outstanding. Well, folks, this has been another installment of the Captain's Table. Our guest today was Henry Ramos. He's a senior fellow at the New School Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. Henry, thank you so much for being with us.
What a great conversation. Thank you so much for all you do, Mike.
Thank you.